There's a new biography out now of the civil rights icon John Lewis, and it's terrific. It's called John Lewis: A Life, and both the New York Times and the New Yorker have named it one of the best books of the year. The author is David Greenberg, who is a professor of history as well as a professor of journalism and media studies at Rutgers University. And we have the great good fortune to have him with us here now. Professor, welcome.
Thank you.
This is a big and wonderful book. In fact, it's so big and so wonderful that we are going to devote 2 programs to it. We'll focus first on John Lewis's incredible career as one of the preeminent leaders of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And Professor Greenberg has graciously agreed to come back for a second program where we'll cover John Lewis's long and successful career in elective politics. So there is so much to cover, so let's get started. John Lewis's background would not normally lead us to think that he would become such a successful leader of such an important movement. So let's go back to the beginning and talk about where he was born and what his childhood was like.
Yeah, it's really an extraordinary story. He came from really the worst kind of poverty. His parents were sharecroppers. They scraped together enough to buy their own plot of land. This is in rural Alabama. He's born in 1940, one of 10 siblings. The parents just worked so hard on the farm. They took extra jobs, his father as a bus driver, his mother as a domestic, washwoman. And from the beginning, from a young age, John Lewis hated the hard work of the farm. They didn't have running water. This was like, taking a bath in a zinc tub. He never had a bed, let alone a bedroom of his own. He was always sharing a bed with one of his many brothers. So he wanted a better life. And of course, he also lived under the boot of Jim Crow segregation. And he also, from an early age, came to hate that. And not surprisingly. But, I'm sure his brothers and sisters and his parents hated it too.
Right.
But he found in himself, that motivation, that desire to find something, to create something better.
So how did he get from this extreme poverty in his background, how did he get a reasonably decent post-secondary education, which sort of got him into the movement?
Yes, I mean, he didn't have a great set of schools, but he did go to one of these Rosenwald schools. The Sears Roebuck magnate Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington had founded these schools around the South. And he just developed this love of reading from an early age. It started with the Bible, but soon it was biography and history, especially black history, but literature and poetry too. And he had teachers, people who encouraged him to read.
But I had a wonderful teacher in elementary school who told me, "Read, my child, read." And I tried to read everything.
He kind of knew that would be kind of a ticket out. Some kids, trick their parents so they can skip school. He did the opposite. His parents needed him to stay home from school to work on the farm.
He wanted to go to school.
He would hide under the porch and rush out and get on the school bus when it came.
Goodness.
Because he loved learning, he loved school. And I think his religion, his mother especially, was very devout. And I think that too was a source of inspiration and motivation. And at around age 15, he discovers Martin Luther King. He hears him give a sermon on the radio. And he says, "This is the man I want to emulate. This is the kind of life I want to lead as a minister who can help bring about something better for my people."
So that leads me to the next question. Explain how, he was such a staunch advocate of nonviolent direct action. I mean, that was like a foundation of his life, and he never wavered from that. And then you mentioned the religious aspect. How did this stuff get started? How did the religion, if it did, lead to the nonviolent aspect of his character?
Right. So it's there even before he goes off to Bible college, which is in Nashville at a small place called American Baptist Theological Seminary. But you do see it when he's young, as a teenager, again, inspired by King. He also has a kind of gentle temperament that I think kind of, acclimates him for the teachings of nonviolence. But after a couple of years in Nashville, he falls in with a group of social gospel ministers, people who are actually connected to King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. One is Kelly Miller Smith, who's kind of the big deal black minister in town. Another is a divinity student at Vanderbilt named James Lawson, who is precisely King's age, who King says knows and understands nonviolence even better than King. He's been to India, he's studied Gandhi. And Lawson sets up these, first it's kind of lectures and a kind of program of study, then it moves into the actual training and workshops where Lewis and a whole group of students really immerse themselves in the study and practice of nonviolence, what Gandhi called satyagraha, the whole philosophy of nonviolence that, it's not just a tactic for John Lewis or for some of the others. It's not just a strategy so that when we're hit and don't fight back, we look sympathetic. It's actually a deep belief system that holds, if you, really love your oppressor, if you love the assailant who beats you, over time, that will change hearts and minds, and that will bring about what they all call the beloved community.
Right. See, you make that clear in your book, and I think that is very difficult for a lot of people, I think understandably, to get. I mean, you can understand it as a tactic, you can understand it as a tragedy, but there, it was almost a religious belief with these guys. So that leads us sort of naturally into the idea that because he was very young still, leads us right into the sit-ins and subsequently the freedom rides. Talk about that a little bit.
Right, so yeah, he's only 20 years old. He's a student at American Baptist, and this is when Lawson and the group decide they're going to try to integrate the segregated lunch counters at places like Woolworth's and McClellan's downtown. Right. And they even have some dry runs, some kind of practice sit-ins where they kind of go in, sit together black and white at the lunch counter to see what will happen. Then in the following February, 1960, they sort of have their thunder stolen when a group in Greensboro
right.
does the same thing first.
And that's what's really famous, the Greensboro
right.
sit-in.
That started it all off, even though this Nashville group was bigger, sort of more trained, more steeped in nonviolence. So, but they're then ready to go. So a couple weeks later, they do their own set of sit-ins, and they start challenging this. And it starts spreading all across the South to one college town after another. Sometimes there are local ministers, people like James Lawson, who are working with these students. Other times it's just spontaneous, a small group. But the Nashville group sort of emerges as the most successful. That spring, they have a big showdown with the mayor on the City Hall steps and confront the mayor, a liberal white man who is sympathetic to them, but also kind of fearful of going too fast. And he agrees to get these merchants to go along with this desegregation. So it's a big victory. Martin Luther King comes to town to sort of trumpet it. And John Lewis is already elevated at that point, if not quite to a national leader, certainly to a leader in this local movement.
How does Lewis become involved in the freedom rides, which I think are some of the scariest things historically? I mean, I remember reading about it in the news at the time I was old enough, but just even the histories of it and the documentaries are scary.
Look, it's an amazing story. Lewis is sort of seen by the ministers in this local movement as someone who, even among a group of exceedingly courageous young men and women, has something special. So there's a call put out by a group called CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, right, to do a ride through the South on Greyhound and Trailways buses to force compliance with a Supreme Court ruling that says you cannot desegregate in interstate travel or even in the terminals and dinettes and so on surrounding them. This was modeled on a much earlier one called The Journey of Reconciliation that was a noble attempt but hadn't gone anywhere back in the 40s. So they think, oh, John Lewis, he'd be perfect for this. So he signs up. It's really a diverse group. Some are students, some are older, northern, southern, white, black. The idea is you pair up and you, as seatmates, black and white, ride together. Right. John Lewis actually leaves the trip to go interview for a fellowship to study abroad. It's kind of like the fellowship that James Lawson had to study in India. And while he's away, horrific violence in Alabama. A group of white supremacists, Klansmen, really an organized campaign, attacks, well, both buses, but the famous one is in Anniston, Alabama, outside Birmingham. The bus is firebombed. They're nearly killed. You know, pictures of the burning bus on the pages of the newspapers the next day. John Lewis at this point is back in Nashville with his friends from the Nashville movement, and they learn that James Farmer, who heads CORE, has decided he's going to pull back after this terrible violence. And these Nashville kids, 21 years old, 22, 23, decide the show must go on. They've got to pick it up. So a whole group of them, led by Lewis and Diane Nash and Bernard Lafayette and others, resume the freedom rides. They go into Birmingham and then to Montgomery, and they decide this thing must continue on.
To the chagrin of the Kennedy administration, and Robert Kennedy's the Attorney General, and they want this stuff stopped.
Right. I mean, the Kennedys feel, ultimately they are sympathetic to the riders, but they say this is just making trouble. People are going to get killed. We don't want this. You've made your point. Let's have a cooling off period is the phrase that Bobby Kennedy uses. And of course, this, to Lewis's way of thinking is intolerable, that the whole point is you must press this thing to its conclusion, even in the face of violence. And there's a press conference. I think it must be Lewis's first national press conference that he gives with James Farmer, Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, they're all there. And he says, look, I don't want to die. I love life. He says, but I'm ready to die if that's what it takes, to bring about freedom and equality for all people. And it's an amazingly kind of mature and sort of dispassionate statement for a man of that age.
John Lewis becomes the head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. And in that position, he becomes one of they even called them the Big Six. He became one of the big civil rights leaders in the early part of the 1960s. So let's skip ahead to the March on Washington, which is in 1963, and John Lewis's role at the March on Washington.
Right. So Lewis at this point has really just been named chairman of SNCC. He was named in June of 1963, and one of the findings of this book, which really hasn't been fully reported or told before, is the continued fight in Nashville between that 1960 victory and a much bigger victory in 63. So after the big 63 desegregation, where it's not just a few lunch counters, but it's most of the restaurants and hotels and so on, people realize this guy in Nashville is doing some pretty amazing things. So he's tapped as chairman. And at that point, SNCC really wasn't so keen on this emerging March on Washington. It was a project of Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, two very eminent civil rights leaders who were really focusing on jobs, on black employment as kind of another front in this.
Actually, two of my longtime heroes.
Yeah, two very admirable men. And then at a certain point, King gets on board too, and it becomes the March for Jobs and Freedom, sort of the jobs being the orientation of the sort of northern black civil rights crusade, and freedom being the watchword of the southern movement. And a few people at SNCC think we really should get on board with this too. Some are hostile to it. They think it's too establishment black politics, too much working with the Kennedy administration rather than against. But Lewis wants to take part, and as this young chairman, he's thrown into it, finds himself, at the White House with all these leaders, doesn't speak at the
So
first
much
meeting.
older than he was.
Yeah, I mean, Philip Randolph is, by this point, I don't know if he's in his 70s, he's kind of the
Probably,
grand old man of
yeah.
the movement. He's just kind of listening and learning and kind of amazed he's even there. He still thinks of himself as the boy from the farm, from, rural Alabama, and here he is with John F. Kennedy in the White House. Now, he also feels an obligation to kind of honor what's emerging as kind of the more militant disposition of SNCC. See, when the march was first conceived, Kennedy hadn't yet proposed his 1963, what becomes the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And so it was kind of idea was to push the administration. But after the showdown with George Wallace at the University of Alabama to force the integration of that university, Kennedy finally introduces the Civil Rights Bill. And so the Kennedy administration shrewdly says, we're going to get on top of this March on Washington thing and make it in support of our bill. And the SNCC people aren't so keen on this. They think they're trying to kind of defang the movement. So Lewis, with the help of others in SNCC, drafts what is a pretty confrontational, kind of no-holds-barred speech.
Not the kind of speech he usually would give.
No, I mean, he's not a rabble-rouser. He's learning kind of to be an effective orator and to fire up a crowd. But a lot of people, the other speeches at the March on Washington, I mean, we all remember Dr. King's, are kind of, bright and positive and optimistic and looking forward to a better future. Lewis's is really holding the administration to account. Well, they circulate an advanced text of it. And the Archbishop of Washington, who's supposed to give the benediction the next day, Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, all these people see it and they say, this is not going to cut it. This is too hostile. It's going to introduce this sour note into what's shaping up as this triumphant day. And so they start negotiating. And even that day, with just sort of a half hour to go before Lewis's speech, they're there under the shadow of the towering colossus of Abraham Lincoln at the memorial, negotiating over line edits of what he can say and what. And sometimes in the histories, it's portrayed as a kind of softening or compromising. But I think this book has the fullest account of what happened.
Right.
And I think you really see actually John Lewis succeeding in softening it just enough to kind of keep Philip Randolph and Martin Luther King and the Kennedys happy, but very much still delivering a harsh message. He doesn't pull his punches altogether. And so the day still emerges with these wonderful headlines, but SNCC gets its message across too.
Right, and John Lewis became even more well-known as a result of that speech. And as your book points out, it was very well received by this enormous audience at the March on Washington.
Yes, it's a really sort of triumphant moment for him as well as for SNCC.
So the following year is Freedom Summer, but we're going to move to 1965 and Selma, Alabama, and the events therein. Talk about that.
Well, Selma had been a site of agitation for voter registration and voting rights for several years. There was a woman there named Amelia Boynton and many other local activists, but she, interestingly, was the mother of the guy Bruce Boynton, who was in the Supreme Court lawsuit that they were trying to uphold with the freedom rides on desegregated travel. So you see how a lot of these local activists, people whose names aren't so well known to Americans today, are also really vital to this whole struggle. And the Selma activists had sort of been hamstrung because a local judge who's kind of in league with Sheriff Jim Clark, the notorious sheriff there, and other local officials, has barred them from gathering in groups of 3 or more, which obviously makes it very hard to organize and have protest marches. And At the end of 1964, they invite in Martin Luther King to help kind of jumpstart their movement. Now, SNCC's been working there with a group for a long time. By this point, there's kind of a rivalry emerging between SNCC and King's SCLC.
Right.
And the SNCC people aren't so keen on this. But because John Lewis is there, and a lot of the people at SCLC are sort of his old friends from Nashville now, they're working it out, and they're staging this through January, February, March of 1965. Well, at a certain point, there's a kind of police riot. The police attack a group of marchers, killing a man named Jimmy Lee Jackson.
Right. And
this leads James Bevel, Bernard Lafayette, Lewis, kind of this core from the Nashville group, to say, we're going to do a big march, a march from Selma to Montgomery that's really going to bring national attention to this movement. SNCC doesn't really want to be a part of it because of these rivalries. So Lewis says, well, I'll go in my capacity as an individual. And he's representing SNCC, he's not representing SNCC. So he's at the head of the march. He's alongside Hosea Williams, who's representing SCLC. Dr. King controversially stays away that day for reasons I won't go into here. It's all in the book. And of course, as they begin their march, going over the now famous Edmund Pettus Bridge, this sort of humpbacked bridge leading out of town over the Alabama River, heading toward Montgomery, they're confronted by the sheriff's posse, but also by state troopers sent by George Wallace.
George Wallace, the state trooper.
Yeah, and Lewis and Hosea Williams ask for a moment to stop and pray, but before they can even do that, the police set upon them, start clubbing them, horsewhipping them. They're up on their horses. Amelia Boynton is hit, is beaten. Many people are kind of laying waste in the streets, and Lewis, of course, is nearly beaten to death and is hospitalized. My photo researcher found this amazing footage, I think it's really never been seen before, of Lewis in his hospital bed that day, being interviewed. What does he talk to the reporters about? The importance of nonviolence.
Isn't that something?
Amazing.
And all of this is on television and becomes big news on the network news, which was the big thing.
March 7th, what we now call Bloody Sunday, is when Lewis is beaten. But of course, the march doesn't go forward. So then there's a question of, we still got to go forward with the march. A couple days later is a Tuesday march where King is there. And King gets to the bridge, same thing happens, and he agrees to head back. This is controversial.
He took a lot of heat.
Right, they call it Turnaround
Yeah.
Tuesday. They sarcastically are singing the song, Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Round, ironically. But then finally, later in the month, the march goes forward over 4 days. It's triumphant. There's a big sort of celebration in Montgomery. All kinds of singers and movie stars and all kinds of people are there to kind of hail this victory. And in the interim, Lyndon Johnson has gotten on board, and he gives a speech in which he famously, not only endorses a Voting Rights Act, but uses the lyrics to the song "We Shall Overcome."
Right.
And it's a song that actually, again, that Nashville group of which John Lewis was a part really elevated to make the anthem of the movement. In the process, there's a minister, James Reeb, who as King sort of summons clergy from all around the country to come down, and he's set upon by local thugs who wind up killing him. And then after the march, while basically driving back, a woman from Michigan, Viola Liuzzo, is assassinated or shot in her car. And so just the brazenness of the murders, of the killing, reinforces federal intervention is needed. It's showing the lengths to which so many people will go to uphold this evil system of Jim Crow, and that without some stronger intervention, it's just going to be lawlessness and murder.
But this, as horrible as everything was in Selma, this led the passage and
Right.
the signing of the Voting Rights Act. Talk about the importance of the Voting Rights Act.
Well, that Voting Rights Act, which was signed that summer, and John Lewis goes and shakes hands with Lyndon Johnson, gets one of the pens that he signs it with, is transformative. I mean, in some ways, maybe even more important than the Civil Rights Act of the previous year.
I think so. I think this was the most important piece of legislation of my lifetime, which is basically the entire period since World War II.
Because it basically unlocks the freedom to vote with federal enforcement, for millions of blacks across the South who had been basically denied that constitutional right. And John Lewis plays an important role. Again, we can talk about it a bit more next time. Running for 7 years in the 1970s, something called the Voter Education Project. Because even after you get the right to vote, you're not automatically registered. You don't necessarily go to the polls.
And there was still resistance.
There was still resistance. There was a combination of both resistance from white supremacists and the old guard, and then also a kind of, learned habit of, I'm just not going to go vote and rock the boat, shake up the system. So Lewis, it becomes his life's work, really. I mean, through these years in the 70s, and even as we know in Congress, he was always talking about the importance of voting, that voting is the most important nonviolent tool we have in a democracy to change our own situation. And he believed that deeply, and it really grew out of that Selma experience.
The word great gets tossed around too easily, I think, but I think you can apply it to John Lewis and his life and his work. This is also a great book. Thank you for being here for this program, and we look forward to welcoming you back for the second half of John Lewis, The Life. Professor David Greenberg, thank you so much.
Thank you, Bob. My pleasure.
I'm Bob Herbert. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. CUNY TV now has an app. Downloading the CUNY TV app lets you join us anytime from anywhere.